Yeah, okay, so my name's Roger Hallam. I'm doing one of my first videos for Beyond Politics. Beyond Politics is a direct action movement, also standing elections. You can find out about it. There's details at the bottom of this video. I'm doing this video about non-violence, how it works, why it's important, why it's vital that it happens at this stage in history, as you might say. I'm trying to recruit people, I guess, to join Beyond Politics, but you can, use the ideas that I'm going to talk about in your own movement, in your own network, whatever, it's pretty general. I think what's interesting is Beyond Politics has just done quite a few controversial actions, kind of thrown paint off over a number of NGOs in London, been very controversial. I think I've been called utter twat. So, just to give a flavour of it. And I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of people, do videos about social change outside the context, so it's all very calm and civilised. And, you can talk about quite heavy things, but it's all a little bit abstract. And what's quite interesting is to do a video about non-violence in the middle of a big shit show, as you might say. And I quite like that idea because then it gives everyone a sort of feel about it, because it's very easy to say, oh yeah, non-violence, that's great. What the suffragettes did, that's great. What the civil rights movement did, that's great. But when you're actually in it, it was like massively controversial. And loads of people are saying, this is total disaster, you're destroying everything and all the rest of it. So I suppose this connects with the idea of sort of praxis, which is a bit of a funny word, but it's a word that I sort of like, which is that, we're not just doing actions, we need to know the theory behind why we're doing actions. And we're not just doing theory, we're not just sitting in a university seminar room, going, yeah, non-violence is a great idea. We're actually going out and doing it. So praxis is like the bringing together of theory and action. And here I am sitting here in this, with all this criticism. And it's interesting to sort of bring some theory into it rather than just being on social media, exchanging insults and what have you. Because there's a reason for doing this sort of stuff. And, it's got its pros and cons. But what I'm going to do in this video is try and take a step back from all the contestation, as it were, and go, okay, so what's the plan? Is there a plan here? Or is this just throwing paint? Is this just vandalism? Is this just some vendetta? Is it some ego thing? Is it an act of power? It's just a load of nonsense? Or is there actually some thought behind it? And obviously I'm going to argue that there's some thought behind it. So before we start, also, I usually say this at the beginning of the videos, is, this is just my own view. I've done research on it. I've been involved in civil disobedience design for 30 odd years, off and on. It's not something I'm thought up about tomorrow. It's going to be my own take, but it's totally the case that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants or bringing them down, depending on your point of view. So there's not really that much I'm going to say which you can't read elsewhere. But again, what makes it interesting, I think, is doing it in the fray. Because in the fray, you've got all that emotion, as you might say, coming around. So just to give a little bit of a lineage, this is very simplistic, but in the 19th century, there was guys like Thoreau and Tolsky. Oh God, what's his name? Tolstoy. I always mix him up with Trotsky, which is always a bit embarrassing. Tolstoy. Anyway, these guys were saying, when you're dealing with, as they would put it, sort of evil governments, then you go into non-violent resistance against them, and that means to disrupt what they do, and you end up in prison and all the rest of it. And that's what the good person should do. It was very moralistic. And then, that inspired Gandhi. And as I'm sure people know, Gandhi did these amazing things in the mid-20th century in terms of getting the British out of India and discrimination and what have you. And then the lineage, broadly speaking, comes through to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the 1960s and dealing with the institutional racism of the Deep South in the States. And then, you have various civil rights and confrontations like ACT UP and gay rights and what have you. And then that comes through to the modern period, and with a lot of sort of quite solid social science being done on civil disobedience, non-violence, and what it actually means, how it works, and how to optimize it. So, that's where we're coming from. That's a little 2-minute history. All right, so, there's loads of different ways of looking at this, but I'm going to start with some sort of theoretical framework. And what I'm going to suggest is, broadly speaking, I'm simplifying, obviously, up to the period of Gandhi in the 20th century, there were two broad ways of dealing with injustice, or violence and what have you. One way was submission. Maybe you send a little delegation every now and again to try and get your rights. Maybe you send a petition, but it's basically you keep your head down and you do these sort of useless things. The peasants go and talk to the landlord, all that sort of stuff. Or you have violent revolt, right? Basically people go out and shoot and slice each other up. And that was it. And they were fairly binary. You're either doing the submissive routine or you're out there butchering people. And, sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. But the point about non-violence is it was like a massive discovery. I mean, I personally think it's the biggest social discovery of the 20th century, which is there's a third way. And the third way is to be disruptive, but not to engage in violence. And a lot of people, even to today, can't quite get their head around it, But it basically means actively disrupting things like throwing paint on buildings or gluing yourself to buildings or blocking a road or, something you actually do, or something you don't do that you should do, which is like don't pay your taxes, don't pay council tax, don't pay your rent. So it's doing something you shouldn't do, or it's not doing something you should do. And there's a whole range of different things. But it's not just about that. It's also, that's the material aspect of it. But there's a psychological, or some people would say spiritual aspect to it, or an emotional aspect to it, which is you are expressing your anger because terrible things are happening. I am disrupting you. I'm going to throw paint on your door. But it's not like hateful. It's not saying you're complete fuckers and we hope you die type stuff, right? It's saying you're doing something wrong. That's our belief, and we're disrupting you in order to raise the issue, to bring it into public focus, your opinion, as it were. And what that translates into is entering into dialogue and negotiation. All right, so in the modern context, like, in Britain today, for the sake of argument, it's not we're not in a classical situation. It's not like people are being murdered in the street by oppressors and there's big violent rebellions going on. But there's the modern sort of context of it is sort of similar. So I would say, like, on the one side of the equation, you've got what I would call the liberal left, which is the old submissive sort of approach, which is we're sending emails, we're going on a march, we're doing a petition. And that liberal left, or that traditional liberal sort of orientation, has the point of view of you mustn't rock the boat. We've got our alliance, we're trying hard, and we all need to keep together because the subliminal idea is we're all quite weak, and if we all start rocking the boat, then, things are going to fall apart and we'll fail even more miserably than we failed before. And then on the other side of the equation, again, broadly speaking, there's a radical left. Now, for me, the radical left is very similar to the sort of, go and chop people up, sort of violent rebellion sort of thing, except it's more a linguistic thing, which is there's bad people and they're fuckers and we hate them and they deserve everything they get. It's what I would call like Calvinistic. It's like you're either with us or you're against us. And if you're against us, that's it. You're not exactly going to hell, but you're going to a secular hell. You're out of here, platformed, all the rest of it, right? And so these two orientations, my argument is, neither of them have anything to do with this innovation of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And what nonviolence does, as I would argue, is does something different to both, which is to disrupt people, so you're not like the liberal left, and you're sort of slim to radical left, but you disrupt people and then open the door to dialogue, which is exactly what the radical left doesn't do. Their idea is you disrupt people, or at least linguistically, on social media, but you're never going to offer to have a chat because you already know they're wrong. What is there to talk about? You see what I mean? So what nonviolence does is takes the best of both worlds, as you might say. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little case study of how this works. And obviously there's lots of different examples of it. This one involves me, and therefore I know quite a bit about it. But there's lots of examples of this sort of dynamic happening. So at King's College, some people may know this story, but in King's College 3 or 4 years ago now, I said to the college that they should divest from fossil fuels. There was a divestment group that got nowhere, doing petitions and sitting on committees for about 3 years. And I said, right, we're going to go and do direct action. And, all the sort of liberal campaigners were going, no, don't do it. This is terrible. It's going to cause division. It's going to be a disaster. I mean, one activist, very well-known activist said, this is a really bad idea, Roger. So I did it anyway. So I went with a bunch of other students. We caused £7,000 worth of damage, throwing paint and spray chalking the central hall, the central Gothic hall, with all these nice colonial statues, the type of thing. And up to that point, we got absolutely nowhere with the college. We said, why don't we sit down and talk and, do the sensible thing? And of course they don't, right? Because they're not interested. But as soon as we threw paint over their spray chalk their hall, the vice principal was down in 5 minutes. I'm not exaggerating. He was down in 5 minutes. And then there was this interesting interaction, which I think pinpoints the sort of contradiction of the liberal position, which is the vice principal came up and he said, Roger, this sort of activity shuts down the conversation. And I said to him, this is the first time we've had a conversation. And, bang, you can imagine his face was, that's it, got him. And this encapsulates the sort of stupidity, let's put it like that, of the liberal position, because it's just not actually looking at the empirical reality. The reality of it is disruption works. It doesn't always work, and you can mess it up by being aggressive, but it works massively more than having a conversation, which actually is never a conversation, as oppressed people know for several hundred years. When the opponent says, let's have a conversation, they're basically saying, piss off. They have a conversation once you disrupted them. And then, after we painted the hall, I went on hunger strike for 2 weeks, and the whole guys were all in panic. And then that's when they had the emergency meetings, and they decided to divest, completely change their corporate strategy in 2 weeks, and signed in front of the press that they were going to divest. So that campaign took 5 weeks, as compared with 3 or 4 years of divestment campaigns. What was the causal factor? The causal factor was the disruptive civil disobedience. And it involved a lot of disruption, but also being polite and firm and friendly, basically, to the university and saying, we want to get something to happen here. So that's sort of how it works, but there's an important element, and this is a little bit complicated, but it's an important element here, which is non-violence doesn't work on something that is a minor issue or something that's wrong. So, for instance, like, when you read a textbook, it's something like, choose your issue, go and do disruption, be polite, and you win, right? So that's what I call a postmodernist construction. In other words, it doesn't believe there's any objective morality, or if you want to be a bit more sophisticated, intersubjective morality. In other words, something in society, there's things that everyone's more or less agreed on. You don't kill your children, you don't do child abuse, you don't murder women, you don't go and destroy a minority. Those are like core values of most societies most of the time, right? So if you're doing civil disobedience about those immoral activities, you're on a winning streak. But if you do civil disobedience or non-violence on, to use a silly example, people wearing red hats, doesn't matter how disruptive you are and how polite you are, people just don't agree with you. So it's not going to happen, So for instance, like with going to the NGOs last week, if we'd sort of thrown paint on the doors and said, we want you to do a campaign in Mozambique, for instance, why? There's no way they're going to agree, even however much paint you're going to throw, because they're going to say that's completely illegitimate. Which brings us to the point of the climate crisis, right? Now, the central thing about the climate crisis is it's the biggest fuck up in human history, objectively, right? It's geophysics. This thing's coming down the road. It's going to be stopped when we put carbon into the atmosphere. It's the most cut and dry catastrophe in human history, right? There's no black and white about it. And as we all know, it's coming down the road and it's already arrived and it's going to get exponentially worse and billions of people are going to die and potentially the human race is going to go extinct. We're looking at 4 degrees of extra warming in the next 50, 70, 90 years. Who cares? The fact of the matter is that 4 degrees, you're looking at 2,000 dead people in Africa all having to migrate. This is basic physics, right? 4 degrees is 8 degrees inland. It's 20 degrees hotter than today on a warm day. That's it. Crops have gone. Mass starvation. It's simple. It's the most simple immorality you could conceive of. So the reason why throwing paint at the NGOs is potentially going to be successful, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, is because we're right. Which is, in our modern, postmodernist society, people have got a problem with the idea of things being right. But there are things that are right and wrong in this world, right? And there's lots of things which aren't as well. There's lots of confusing things. But there are some things that are really straightforward. Rape is pretty straightforward. It's wrong, full stop. Murdering the next generation is straightforward, full stop. So civil disobedience comes into its own when you have a massive oppression or a massive immorality or a massive contradiction between what a society or a government says it's about or an NGO says it's about and what they're actually doing. All right, so I'm going to make a case for why non-violence works, particularly in this context of throwing paint over the doors of NGOs, right? So I'm making a case. I'm not going to say it's airtight. I'm not even going to say it's definitely going to work, but I'm going to say it's in the ballpark of what could or should work, okay? So there's a guy called Gene Sharp, and he's like the godfather of non-violence theory. And what he says is basically there's lots of pillars in society, and which maintain the status quo, maintain the government. There's the army, there's the church, there's the businessmen, but there's also the sort of liberal civil society organisations, at least in many societies. And the name of the game is to undermine those pillars so that the whole edifice starts to crack and you get structural reform, right? And you choose one of them, you engage in civil disobedience. Now, one of the things about the NGOs, I don't want to get into the whole reason why NGOs are a problem, but one of the fundamental problems is that they exist in the public sphere to sort of dampen down the raging emotion around the catastrophe of the climate situation. You know, there'll be articles and they'll say, oh, you know, climate change is going to destroy the next generation, and they'll put, this is of concern to us, and it shows a lack of ambition. And this is what liberals do all the time, is they'll always ameliorate things because they want a peaceful sort of situation. They just want things to move along. So in this situation, what you're trying to do, and the specific ask, and it's important to have a specific ask, you know, I'm not going to the NGOs just to say you're horrible. The specific ask is to cross the Rubicon of going from lawful activity to unlawful activity. And secondly, to engage in mass mobilisation, both of which are necessary at this stage in history in order to deal with this catastrophe. Okay, so one of the reasons for focusing on liberal organisations, for want of a better word, is they already know they're being crap. Right, you know, if you go to a hardcore army or something, they really don't care. You know, maybe they're semi-fascist or something. But you choose like the liberal organisations because there's plenty of people in there that already want this to happen. So, for instance, when I went to King's College and, you know, spray chalked their hall, when I went to talk to the vice principal, and he said, yeah, I know there's an existential crisis, which is a posh way of saying, you know, next generation's fucked, you know, and everyone agrees with you, Roger. So I was going like, well, why is nothing happening? And he said, well, organisational inertia, which is another posh word of saying no one can really get it together. So in other words, they need a non-violence kick, right? So through going to the NGOs with a specific ask about the biggest like catastrophe, the biggest immorality in human history, you've got a great combination, right? Which is they're almost there anyway. So I know that some of the people in the NGOs are already talking about upping their game, let's put it like that. So I've got that evidence already. But theoretically, I know it's on the cards, which is why I'm trying to be theoretical in this video. You see what I mean? Because before you do something like this, you don't know. But your theory informs you there's a good reason. Why? Because you know that liberal organisations are generally full of people that want to see something happening. And twice, you're totally fucking right. You know, this is total disaster. And things need to happen, like now, guys. So I'm not saying the NGOs are going to change their tune. You know, my personal view is it probably needs a lot more people throwing a lot more paint, right? But what we're doing is we're then writing to the NGOs and saying, right, you know, we've made this action and we are angry and we are condemning, but we also want to have dialogue because at the end of the day, we're all complicit. Right? This isn't a judgment thing. So if you want to have a conversation, so we're doing that at the moment, and you know, maybe next week they'll have a chat. But the prize here, and this is the exciting thing, is the prize here is that with these big organisations, they potentially can bring out thousands of people, or maybe hundreds of people, which in a UK context is massively important. So for the sake of argument, you know, Christian Aid, I know that Christian Aid are thinking about doing civil disobedience, but they haven't quite got there, you know. In the meantime, the world's burning, so come on, guys. But if they, you know, wrote to all their membership and their chief executives or whatever got from behind their desks and did a national tour and said, this is a violation of all Christian values, we need to get down to London and sit in the road with Extinction Rebellion or Beyond Politics or whatever, or do their own thing if they want to do their own thing, then you're basically levering several thousand people. And we know that if several thousand people engaged in civil disobedience and got arrested, then we could be in the ballpark of actually seeing policy change which would reduce carbon emissions, which would save human lives, right? So you can see the sort of domino effect. So the exciting thing here is if you get a bunch of courageous, brave, mad people to go and engage in civil disobedience against NGOs or the liberal class, you potentially open up this massive leverage, which could actually trigger what we need to see. So if you're watching this video, this is my sales sort of little bit, is if you're feeling miserable that you can't actually affect massive change, empirically, you're wrong, right? That's my argument, as someone that's researched this, is you can have a massive effect if you're smart and you choose the right target and you engage in really disruptive activity and you're polite and enter into dialogue afterwards, okay? Those are the things you've got to do. And that could create massive change. So if you're interested in this, and it's a numbers game at the end of the day, then there's a little link or something to a Zoom call at the bottom of this video. Or if you're watching this video quite a long way down the line, you can just contact Beyond Politics. And then you can come along and, there's no pressure. You can take it from there. Okay, so I just want to finish with a little end comment, which is, in a lot of my videos, what I'm trying to say is you're not going to be sustainable in doing civil disobedience unless you have what I could call a virtue ethics orientation, which, paradoxically, given what I've just said, means you're not actually concerned with outcomes, right? So everything I've told you sounds a little bit like, oh, if you do this, we'll get that, which is true, right? I mean, there's no point pretending that this doesn't work. But the fundamental point here is that ethically and also strategically in the longer term, you have to ground your ethical action in ethics, right? In this is the right thing to do. We're at a point in history where we've possibly left it too late to save the next generation from indescribable suffering due to the climate emergency. But in so much as we haven't, it's necessary for the whole liberal establishment to step up and engage in civil disobedience, not least to save their own bacon, right? And that's an end in itself. So even if they're not going to respond, or even if this theory doesn't work, it's still important to go and make that statement of horror, inaction and passivity and appeasement at this point, So I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to people signing up. Thanks so much.